Hello, and welcome back. I'm Aiden, your narrator for tonight. I'm glad you're here. Take a breath, let your shoulders drop, and let the day begin to loosen its hold on you. Tonight, I'll take you somewhere older than maps, into the deep heart of a forest where the ferns carry their own light. I'll tell you the story of Elara, a woman who has spent 40 years walking the same ancient path into the dark, guided by nothing but a faint green glow and an understanding that most people never come to know. It is a story about what it means to be a keeper of something sacred, about the quiet that grows between a person and a place over a lifetime, and about the particular kind of wisdom that can only be found in the dark, in the still, in the slow. Before we begin, we'd love to hear from you. Where are you tonight, and what drew you here? We'd also love to know what kind of worlds you'd like to visit next. Your ideas shape everything we create, so please leave a thought in the comments when you wake. If you'd like to be part of something closer, our Patreon is a warm place to land, where early stories and quiet extras are waiting for those who want to go deeper. And if Terranash has found its way into your nights, a subscription is the simplest gift you can give us. It keeps this little world alive, and it means more than we can say. Now let yourself be still. Feel the weight of your body settling, your legs, your back, your hands. Breathe slowly. Let each breath carry less and less of the day with it, until there is nothing left but this moment, this voice, and the sound of something ancient beginning to stir in the dark. When you're ready, let's step together into the forest, where the ferns are just beginning to glow, and where Elara has been waiting, patient as the trees themselves, to show us what the night has always known. The forest began where the light gave up. Not all at once. The boundary between the open hillside and the trees was gradual, a softening rather than a wall. The last of the cottage garden became rough grass, and the rough grass became low bracken, and the bracken pressed against the first of the outer trees. And then the canopy closed overhead, and the world rearranged itself into something older and less certain. Elara had walked this boundary so many times that she felt the transition in her body rather than observed it with her eyes. A subtle shift in the air temperature, a change in the quality of the silence, the way the ground softened slightly underfoot as the soil deepened with centuries of fallen leaf. She was 63 years old, and she had been making this walk since she was 23. In those early years, she had carried a lantern. She was not ashamed of this. The forest at night was not a place for bravado, and she had been very new to it then, new to the path, new to the gift, new to the particular quality of attention the forest required. The lantern had been a concession to her own nervousness, a small flame to hold on to while she learned to read the other lights. But somewhere around her 30th year, she had set it down on the cottage doorstep and walked into the dark without it, and she had not missed it once. The ferns gave enough light if you knew how to look, and she knew how to look. Tonight was a clear night. Above the canopy, she had seen stars as she left the cottage, the particular bright scattering of a sky without cloud, the kind of night that made the air feel closer to winter than the season warranted. She could not see the stars now, inside the trees, but she carried the memory of them with her as she walked, the way you carry a conversation after it has ended. The forest held the cold air in the hollows between its roots and released it slowly as she moved through, so that she walked through alternating bands of warmth and chill, her breath showing white and then invisible and then white again. She found this interesting, still. After 40 years, she still found almost everything about this walk interesting. This was not something she had worked at. It was simply the nature of the forest to offer new things. The same path, walked 1,000 times, and still a slightly different quality of darkness tonight than there had been last night. A different configuration of sounds in the canopy. The smell of the air carrying something it had not carried in the previous week. A faint thread of something floral that she could not source and did not need to. Things changed here, slowly and continuously. The way all living systems changed, imperceptibly from day to day, and yet profoundly over years. She was a record of those changes. Her body held the memory of 40 years of this same walk in a way that no notebook ever could. The first silver ferns appeared about 10 minutes in. They were scattered along the edges of the path here, young ones lower to the ground, their fronds still in the process of unfurling. The glow at this hour was at its earliest stage, a faint iridescence at the very tips of the fronds, easy to miss unless you were looking for it. Elara always paused here for a moment, not because the sight was unexpected, she knew exactly when and where it would appear, but because the first sight of the glow, each night, produced in her something she could only describe as gratitude. A warmth in the chest that was not physical, a sense of something continuing. She had tried to explain this to a botanist once, a young man who had come to study the bioluminescent phenomenon, and spent 3 weeks mapping the fern colonies, and taking samples and filling notebooks with careful observations. He had been earnest and thorough, and completely incapable, she thought, of receiving what the ferns were actually offering. He had seen the light, he had quantified it, he had explained it, and he had missed it entirely. She had come to think of the ferns the way she thought of certain people, specific people, the rare ones, who held their knowledge lightly, who had understood something profound without needing anyone to know that they had understood it. There was a quality of restraint in the ferns that she had always respected. They did not perform their luminescence. They did not orient themselves toward observers. They simply glowed because glowing was what they were, and the darkness that surrounded them was not something they pushed against, but something they simply occupied, at home in it, making it beautiful without intending to. She had tried for many years to live like that. She was not sure she had succeeded, but the ferns had been a good teacher. She did not hold this against him. Understanding came in different shapes, and his shape was not wrong, only narrow. The ferns were bioluminescent organisms, and the mechanism of their glow was knowable and known. These things were true, but the ferns were also something else, something that the language of biology could describe but not quite reach, the way language can describe music without ever producing the experience of sound. Elara knew this the way she knew the path, not from being told, but from 40 years of walking. The path curved here, following an old watercourse that had shifted centuries ago and left its ghost in the form of a slight depression in the ground, a meandering channel through which water still ran in the wet months, and which remained even now slightly damper and darker than the soil on either side. The ferns loved this old watercourse. They grew densely along its edges, their roots reaching down toward the memory of water, and at this hour, their collective glow cast a channel of soft light along the path that made the way forward easy to follow. Elara walked its edge with the ease of long habit, one hand occasionally reaching to brush the tips of the fronds as she passed. She thought about her mother, not for any particular reason, or perhaps because her mother had first brought her to this forest at night at the age of 22 and had shown her what the ferns did when the right kind of darkness fell. Her mother had not been a keeper. She had been something simpler and perhaps more important, a person who paid attention. She had come to this forest as a walker, in the ordinary sense, for 40 years before Elara was born, and she had noticed the ferns, and she had kept the noticing to herself for most of her life. And then, when Elara was old enough, she had shared it. That was all. That had been everything. Her mother had died when Elara was 31. She had been sitting in the same armchair she always sat in the small house 2 villages over, with a book open in her lap and a cup of tea half drunk on the table beside her, and she had simply stopped. The book was one she had already read, which was the kind of detail that stayed with you. She had already read the book and had chosen to read it again. Elara had thought about that detail many times over the years. There was something in it, some quality of having found the things that were worth returning to, and returning to them without apology. Her mother had known what she loved. She had known the forest and the ferns and certain books and certain kinds of weather, and the particular quality of an afternoon when the light came in low from the west and turned everything briefly golden. She had loved these things quietly and thoroughly, without needing them to be more than they were. Elara tried to live that way. She was not sure she always managed it, but she tried. The path narrowed. This was where the forest became itself more fully, where the outer trees, which were younger and more approachable, gave way to the older growth at the forest's heart. The trees here were wider and more widely spaced, their trunks too large to wrap your arms around, their root systems surfacing in places and creating a landscape of low ridges and soft hollows that you had to step around and between. The canopy was denser here too, and yet paradoxically, there was more light because the ferns that grew among the roots of the old trees were fully mature, and their glow was at full brightness by now, the bioluminescence producing enough soft illumination to see your hands clearly in front of your face. She had read somewhere that the light produced by bioluminescent organisms was described as cold light, light produced without heat, without combustion, a purely chemical process. She liked this phrase, cold light. It suited the ferns exactly. Their glow was gentle rather than warming, clarifying rather than comforting. The kind of light that allowed you to see clearly without allowing you to forget where you were. You could not mistake it for firelight, or for sunlight, or for any ordinary domesticated flame. It was something else, something that belonged to the dark and was only visible within it. The forest had its own grammar. She had taken years to learn even part of it, the language of which sounds meant what, which silences were significant, which changes in the light indicated a shift in the mood of the place. She would not call it a mood, precisely, to anyone who asked. Elara would use a more careful word, condition, state. The forest was always in some state, a state of alertness or deep rest, of moisture or drying, of the particular atmospheric quality that came before rain and the one that came after it. She had learned to read these states the way a sailor reads the sky, not to control the weather, but to know how to be in it. Tonight the forest was in a state she recognized as deep ease, nothing watchful in it, nothing held back. The old trees simply were, going about their profound and imperceptible work of growing and receiving and releasing, utterly unconcerned with the small figure moving along the path between them. She felt this as a kind of companionship. To be unconcerned with was not the same as to be indifferent to. The forest knew she was here. It simply did not require anything of her. The clearing was not visible from a distance. This was by design, or rather, by the design of the forest itself, which had arranged the old growth in such a way that the clearing appeared suddenly, as a presence rather than a view. You would be walking between the massive trunks, following the faintly glowing path, and then the ground would shift slightly under your feet, the soil becoming denser and moister, and then the trees would simply be gone on all sides, and you would be in the clearing, and the clearing would be around you, and that would be all. Elara stepped into it and stopped, as she always stopped. The clearing was perhaps 30 feet across. The ferns here were the oldest she had found anywhere in this forest, some of them taller than her shoulder, their fronds wide and overlapping, the whole colony glowing with a depth and steadiness that the younger ferns on the path could only approximate. The canopy above was closed, the old growth having knit itself together over the clearing's edges so that the sky was completely hidden. Instead, the light came from all sides and from below, from the ferns, from the moss underfoot, which carried its own faint luminescence in this season, creating an atmosphere that had no shadows, only gradients of soft green-silver light. The clearing changed her breathing every time. She had noticed this over the years and never fully explained it to herself. The moment she stepped in from the path, something in her respiratory rhythm shifted, slowed, deepened, became more deliberate. As if her body knew, before her mind caught up, that this was a place that deserved a different quality of attention, a different pace. She had asked herself whether the air in the clearing was actually different, whether there was more oxygen here, some biological gift from the dense fern colony, something measurable. She didn't know. Elara suspected it didn't matter. Whatever the mechanism, the result was that she always arrived at the pool already calmer than she had been on the path. She noticed tonight the particular sound of the clearing. Most people thought of forests as places of silence, but they were not silent. They were simply quiet in a different register than the human world. The clearing had its own sounds. The minimal sound of the fern fronds moving in an air current too light to feel on the skin. The faint intermittent drip of condensation falling from the canopy's edge. The barely audible sound of the soil itself, organic matter continuing its patient processes of decomposition and transformation, inaudible individually, but present, she always thought, as a kind of underlying hum beneath everything else. And below that, below even that, the sound she could never quite locate or name, something that might be her own blood moving through her ears, or might be the forest's deepest frequency, felt more than heard. She knelt, and the sounds settled around her like water finding its level. In the center of the clearing, the pool. She had never found any record of this pool, not in the historical surveys of the forest, not in the naturalist accounts she had read, not in any map, old or recent. It was small, perhaps 8 feet across, and perfectly circular, and the water in it was still in a way that exceeded what stillness normally meant, not merely without ripples, but without the suggestion of ripples. A surface so settled that it seemed to have forgotten that water was capable of movement. Elara had her own theory about the pool, which she had never shared with anyone. She believed it was very old. Not old in the sense of having existed for many centuries. Old in the sense of being one of the places in the world where the membrane between the surface of things and the depth of things was thinner than usual. She had no scientific basis for this. She did not require one. 40 years of sitting beside it had taught her things that could not be cross-referenced with any published text, and she had made her peace with that long ago. She knelt at its edge. The moss received her knees with the softness of something that had been waiting. She rested her hands on her thighs, closed her eyes for a moment, and simply arrived. This was the practice. Her mother had not taught it to her. Her mother had only shown her the clearing and then stepped back as if to say, "Now you find out what this is." What Elara had found over the years was not a technique but a relationship. Not something you did to the pool, but something you brought to it. You brought yourself, whatever state you were in, and the pool received it, and something was exchanged, and you were different afterwards. Not always dramatically, not always consciously, but always reliably, in some way that mattered. She opened her eyes and looked at the water. The surface of the pool reflected the glow of the ferns around it, greens and silvers layered over each other in the still water. The light from all sides meeting at the center in a complex and shifting pattern. But it also showed something beneath this, not a reflection of the sky, since there was no sky visible, not a reflection of the clearing, since the angle was wrong for that. Something else, something that seemed to come from within the pool itself, from its depth rather than its surface. She had spent a long time in her early years trying to determine what exactly she was seeing in the pool. She had tested various explanations: bioluminescence from organisms in the water, trick of light from the surrounding ferns, her own mind filling the surface with meaning that wasn't there. None of these explanations had satisfied her completely, not because they were impossible, but because they were insufficient. They explained the mechanism without explaining the experience. What the pool showed her tonight was this: time moving sideways. She had no better phrase for it. The pool did not show the past exactly, or the future exactly. It showed the breadth of the present, the way the current moment extended outward in all directions, beyond what ordinary attention could perceive. She saw, felt, knew the forest as it existed in this moment, the whole of it, from the young ferns at its edges to the ancient root system at its heart, the whole living system breathing in the cold dark, each organism going about its quiet work. She felt the soil beneath the clearing, the layered centuries of fallen leaf and absorbed rainfall, the intricate web of fungal threads that connected root to root, tree to tree, across the whole of the forest floor. Elara was aware of small creatures in the undergrowth. A mouse moving through the fern roots 20 feet to her left, a fox passing somewhere to the north, a pair of owls in the old growth whose hearing mapped the world in frequencies she could barely imagine. She felt all of this as one feels the weather, not as a list of separate things, but as a condition, a texture of the moment. The forest at this hour, on this night, in this season. And she felt, as she always felt in these moments, the particular grief and joy of being a single human consciousness inside something so vast. The grief of smallness, of being brief and individual and bounded in a way that the forest was not. The joy of belonging to it regardless, of being here, of being, in this small way, a part of the larger breathing. She let the tears come when they came. They always came, sooner or later. She did not know how long she knelt there. This was the nature of the clearing. It held time differently from the outside world. She might be there for 20 minutes or 2 hours, and she would not be able to say, afterward, which it had been. Her body would tell her eventually. The ache in her knees, the chill in her hands, the dry feeling behind her eyes from having held them too still for too long. These were the signals she used to know when the communion had run its natural course. Tonight, the signal came as a gradual softening of the pool's depths, the quality of what it was showing her fading to a simpler thing, the forest becoming just the forest again, rather than the vast and conscious entity it had felt like a moment before. She recognized this transition. The pool offered what it offered, and then withdrew the offering, the way a dream releases you as morning approaches. You did not hold on. You thanked it and let it go. She pressed her palms flat against the cool moss and rose slowly to her feet. Her knees spoke their usual complaint. Her back added its own commentary. She stood in the clearing for a moment, feeling the particular quality of the air after the communion, cleaner somehow, or rather less cluttered, as though some sediment that had been suspended in her had settled. She looked around at the ferns, at the glow of them, at the way the light fell evenly across everything in the clearing, without preference or hierarchy. She thought about the years when the pool had not shown her anything at all. There had been a period, 3 years, perhaps 4, in her mid-40s, when she had come to the clearing every night and knelt beside the pool and looked at its surface and found nothing but water and the reflection of the ferns. No depth, no opening, no quality of something being offered. Just the simple physical fact of still water in a small hollow in a forest. She had continued to come because she did not know what else to do, and because even without the visions, even when the pool was simply a pool, there was still the clearing and the ferns and the walk in and out and the particular quality of attention the place demanded. These things still nourished her in their way. A forest in which she had once had an extraordinary experience was still, at minimum, a forest. And she loved forests. The visions had returned eventually, not with announcement, not with any change in the circumstances that she could identify. One night she knelt by the pool, and it was simply, again, deep. She had wept that night, not only from relief, but from having learned something in the years of absence that she could not have learned any other way. That the practice was not contingent on the peak experience. That showing up in the dry times was its own form of faithfulness, and that faithfulness, it turned out, was the whole of what was required. She thought of this now, kneeling at the pool's edge, in a year when the visions came reliably, and the forest felt close and the ferns were bright. She held the memory of the dry years not as a shadow but as context. The depth of this moment included the shallowness of those. You could not have one without the other. "Thank you," she said, quietly, to the clearing. She had started saying this about 15 years in, and she had never felt foolish for it. The clearing did not require gratitude and did not withhold itself from those who gave none. But she gave it anyway, because she wanted to, because it seemed like the right acknowledgement of what had just occurred between her and this place. The walk home was slower than the walk in. It always was. Not because she was tired, though she was, but because the return journey asked something different of her. Going in, she was oriented toward the clearing, her attention pulled forward by anticipation. Coming back, she was carrying something, not an object, not a thought exactly, but a quality, a particular register of attention that the communion left behind, that needed to be held gently rather than moved through quickly. If she walked too fast on the way home, she lost it. It dissipated like warmth lost through an open window. So she walked slowly. She let the ferns brush her legs as they had on the way in. She noticed the same channel of the old watercourse, the same curve in the path where the great roots surfaced, the same places where the canopy thinned enough to show, between the branches, the faintest suggestion of stars. She paused once, about halfway back, beside a tree she had always thought of as the eldest. She had no real way of knowing its age. The tree had been large when she first began walking this path, and it was larger now, imperceptibly larger, in the way of very old trees who have long since passed the threshold where human timescales can register their growth. Its trunk was wide enough that she could lean against it, which she did, her back against the bark, her face tilted up toward the canopy. The bark was cool and slightly damp through the back of her coat. She could feel the solidity of the tree through the fabric, something so settled in its position, so deeply committed to this particular spot on this particular hillside, that it made her own temporariness feel less like loss and more like relief. She did not have to be permanent. Elara did not have to be the kind of thing that lasted for centuries. The forest walker could be what she was, brief and warm and here, and that was exactly enough. She rested there for a while. Then she continued home. She thought about nothing in particular. This too was part of the practice. The mind after the pool was best left unscheduled. Given nothing to do, it sorted itself quietly, laid things down, picked other things up, made connections, and released them before they became fully conscious. By the time she reached the edge of the forest, she was usually unable to say what she had thought about on the way home, but she was always, without exception, clearer. The forest boundary arrived the way it always did, gradually and then all at once. The old trees became younger ones, the canopy lifted, the air changed, and then she was standing in the bracken with the open hillside ahead of her, and the cottage lamp warm in the distance. She paused and looked back. The forest was dark from this angle, or not dark exactly, but simply not revealing itself. She knew the ferns were still glowing in there, the path still luminous, the clearing still holding the pool in its moss-soft center. But from outside, looking in, there was only the dense edge of the tree line and the first suggestions of larger trunks going back into shadow. This was the thing about the forest. It offered everything and concealed everything simultaneously. It was not secretive exactly. It was simply itself, regardless of whether anyone was looking. The ferns would glow whether she came or not. The pool would show its depths to the clearing, whether she knelt beside it or not. She was invited, not required. Received, not needed. She found this enormously comforting. The cottage was warm inside. She had left the small stove burning, and the heat met her at the door like a familiar thing, pressing itself against the cold she had brought in from the forest. She hung her coat on its hook and stood for a moment in the middle of the room, not doing anything, just being back. The room held 40 years of evenings like this one. The books on their shelves, the dried specimens on the table, the notebooks stacked by the window, all of it accumulating, slowly, into a record of a life lived in relationship with one specific piece of the world. She was not sure sometimes whether she had shaped this room or the room had shaped her. Both, probably. The relationship went both ways. She put the kettle on. While it heated, she stood at the window and looked out at the dark hillside and the darker line of the forest beyond it. The stars were still there, clear and cold above the tree canopy, the same ones she had seen on the way out, and the same ones that had been above that forest for every one of her 63 years, and for all the years before that. A faint green suggestion at the forest's edge, not quite visible, not quite not. The ferns, glowing in the dark, doing what they had always done. The kettle spoke its quiet note, and she turned from the window. She made the tea with the same attention she brought to everything. The right amount of time, the right temperature, the right cup. Small rituals mattered to her. They were a way of being present in the ordinary, of saying, with action rather than words, "This moment also is worth doing carefully." She sat in her chair with the cup warming her hands and looked at the notebooks on the window ledge. 40 years of entries. The first ones in a young woman's careful handwriting. The later ones looser, more confident, more willing to leave things unfinished. She did not read them often. The record was not really the point. The record was just the residue of the practice, the sediment left behind by all those evenings, all those walks, all those quiet moments beside the pool. The practice itself lived in her body now, in the way she moved through the forest, in the way she listened, in the 40 years of accumulated trust between her and this particular piece of the world. She thought about the people who would come to this forest tomorrow. Walkers with good boots and bright jackets. Perhaps a photographer. Perhaps a family with children who would run ahead on the path and be called back from the tree roots. They would see a beautiful forest. They would take photographs of the light coming through the canopy and the interesting textures of bark and the small flowers at the path's edge. They might notice the ferns. Probably they would, because even in daylight the ferns were lovely, their fronds wide and architectural and quietly impressive. But they would not see what she saw at night, and that was fine. The forest offered different things to different kinds of looking. What it offered to a running child and what it offered to a 63-year-old woman who had been coming here for 40 years were completely different gifts, and both were real. She had stopped thinking, a long time ago, that her way of receiving the forest was the right way or the only way. It was simply her way, the one that had been given to her by circumstance and temperament and 40 years of showing up. Someone else might find their own. Outside, the forest kept its light. Inside, Elara kept her warmth, and the night held both of them gently, as the night always had, asking nothing, offering everything, patient beyond any human measure of the word.